I want to welcome you to our program today and thank you for joining us. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs. I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I want to just quickly mention that we've got a couple other events coming up in the next week or so. Next week, March 3rd, Len Nichols is joining us to talk about the third iteration of health reform, this one being inspired by President Joe Biden. And that's March 3rd, it's at noon. And online you can find the link to that. And then coming up on March 9th, former Republican Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty is joining us to talk about his idea of how to modernize the Republican Party. Let me start, though, with our program today, which is brought to you in partnership with the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Certificate in Election Administration program here at the Humphrey School. Just a quick word about the Certificate in Election Administration. I know some of you are taking classes, others are thinking about it, and maybe some of you ought to be thinking about it. It's a pioneering online program that shares best practices with current election officials, and we prepare students who have not yet entered the field but would like to. It's an online 12-credit course. It's taught by prominent leaders in election administration from all over the country. It's accessible 24 hours a day. You fit it into your schedule. We have a strong placement record, and some of you in the field know that there's a good amount of turnover coming in the next few years. If you'd like more information, you can contact us at cea@umn.edu. So let me enthusiastically begin by welcoming your participation. You will see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. Please give us questions or comments. We really appreciate those. They become a core part of the conversation we're going to have over the next hour, and we'll get to as many as possible. Let's begin today's terrific program, Voting: What Changed in 2020? We are pleased and delighted to have with us Wendy Underhill, who's Director of Elections and Redistricting at the National Conference of State Legislatures. Wendy will be moderating, and I now turn it over to Wendy Underhill. Thank you, Wendy.
Well, thank you, Larry. On behalf of NCSL, I want to say how much I really appreciate the work that you and Lee Chittenden are doing here at the University of Minnesota to support our nation's election officials. I wish I had had this opportunity decades ago when I was doing my MPA. I think I would have been a good election official, and I missed my chance. So I'm a little bit of a wannabe for all the folks out there who are actually doing the work on the ground. And I always love to learn from the folks who actually do run the elections, and we'll get a chance to hear some of that today. As Larry said, we're here to talk about voting, what changed in 2020, and I'll share a couple of thoughts of my own before I turn to the panel. One thing that changed is that election administration was never front page news until 2020. And I'm pretty sure that most election administrators preferred it when it wasn't on the front page. There is, of course, the silver lining when it's on the front page. Election officials have an opportunity to explain their processes and share sort of the details of the work that they do. The second thing I'll say is that the public didn't know a lot about how elections were run before 2020. It was just sort of assumed, like we assume that roads are there for us. We assume that elections are there for us as well. So because of all the attention on it, people realized that elections are really about the details. And in 2020, the focus was largely on the details relating to absentee or mail voting, but the details on running safe in-person operations were every bit as important as well. So I am hoping that with our conversation today, we'll be able to zoom in on those details and then zoom out and get the big picture as well. To do that, we have two different states represented. The states are very different from each other. We're going to start in New Jersey, which is the state where my parents hailed from. And I spent many happy times there with grandparents. It's obviously East Coast, it's obviously mostly urban, but what you might not know about New Jersey is that its elections are run by a complex web of local boards. There's a board in each county for voter registration and a separate board for the elections, if I've got that straight. Bob, you can straighten me out if I'm not right. And that their chief election official is an appointed Secretary of State. So representing this great state of New Jersey, we are delighted to have Bob Giles with us. He is the state election director and has been in that role since 2008. And that means that he has worked under Republican governors and under Democratic governors. And that meant that he had to keep the same nonpartisan approach throughout those years of working in the field. And then if we can, we're going to move west to Montana, a state about as different from New Jersey as it can be. And in Montana, elections are run by elected county clerks, and their chief election official is an elected officer, the Secretary of State. And that seems pretty normal when you're in the West, but I just want to make the point that how we structure our elections is different from state to state. And we hope we'll have Representative Wendy McKamey with us. She was first elected to office in 2014, I'm fairly sure, and her election was decided by 16 votes. So she knows how important every single vote is. And then we have one person with us today who's been watching the national scene, and that's Teague Beckwith, a national political reporter for Bloomberg News. I know him as a reporter. He calls with good questions, and then his stories are always first rate, which is why we were delighted that he said yes to coming and joining us. And then I just learned that he teaches journalism at Georgetown. So he will be able to give a little bit of a national perspective on what happened in the 2020 elections. And Bob, I'm going to start with you. What was going on in New Jersey in January of 2020? And then what was going on at the end of the year?
Thank you for having me, Wendy. And this is a great panel I'm really looking forward to today. Before I start, I just want to, if you'll indulge me for one moment, just to, the reason we were able to get here today is because of all the local election officials out there. And they really are the unsung heroes, and I really want to start by just like thanking them. And I think that's really critical. They get overlooked a lot. They are the folks that really make things happen. So a lot of what I am going to talk about today was things that they had to implement, and sometimes on a very short notice. So I know my colleagues around the country would say the same about their local election officials, but in New Jersey, I think we have the best local election officials in the country. Since I'm the only election director on the panel today, that will stand. So jumping into where we were in January, obviously it was a different world in January. The focus was on cybersecurity and protecting the election. Coming off of 2016, we worked for years to make sure we were ready for the next presidential, for the 2020. So the decisions we were making at that time and the plans we were laying out at that time were really based on how do we protect the election. And so like in New Jersey, we decided to go to a new voter registration system, was one of the decisions. It was a voter registration system built around security, and it was really based on that. And so we launched it because we wanted to have this secure election, and we knew there's always a challenge when you launch a new system, especially in a presidential year. So we asked our counties to kind of take on a big challenge with that. And of course, we get into March and the whole world changes, and the focus changes. But I think what's important to remember is even though everything changed in March, the work that we had done up to that point, and not just cybersecurity, but just coming together, working on continuity of operations plans, doing tabletop training exercises, getting us ready for emergencies, whether they were physical or cyber. And I think that really positioned us well. Even though the crux of it came out of cybersecurity, it put us in a position to really be ready for something like this to the best of our ability. And had 2016 not happened, I don't know that we would have been as ready for a pandemic. And so I think there was a lot of benefits to having that mindset. All our partnerships, and I think that was really important. the partnerships we developed over those, from 2016 up through 2020 and continue with the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, CISA, we have all of these organizations and these agencies that were out there that we didn't know them in 2016. And now we're all a very tight-knit group. We have a government coordinating council that is a mix of state election officials, secretaries of state, and local election officials. And they're able to really kind of pass the word around the country. So going into March, like I said, that was kind of the focus. We were going to be secure. And then when the pandemic started and really hit, it really did change everything. People were pushing elections off. We moved our spring elections further into the spring to give us a time to really get a handle on everything. At that time, there was a concern that we couldn't get PPE, the protective equipment. We couldn't get the equipment we needed to process more vote by mail ballots. So there was a big concern if we were heading in this direction of all vote by mail, could we pull it off? And so for New Jersey, we pushed our primary out to July from June, and to give us a little breathing room, we did a hybrid of where we started down the road of all vote by mail by sending the Republicans and Democrats, the registered Republicans, registered Democrats ballots, and then unaffiliated voters got applications for vote by mail ballots. So and it was kind of a chance to really dip our toe in the all vote by mail world, and it ended up being very successful. We opened up 50% of our polling places because some people still wanted to vote in person. Some people just felt more comfortable that way. And then as we moved to November, the decision was made to go all vote by mail. And we felt that, that we had that experience. I'm not saying it wasn't a challenge, but by having that experience, it allowed us to really kind of position ourselves, fix what may have been an issue during the primary. And then, we were able to work through a lot of that, and we can get into some of the more details later. But then as we shifted to the end of the year, we found ourselves in a position to try and get everything ready for the Electoral College. And one of the things we did in New Jersey, we allowed the ballots to be counted early, 10 days early. So that was a huge help for us. Because you saw, and we all saw in the media where, if you waited till election day to count, it created obviously some controversy. So that was a big advantage we had, getting everything counted, kind of taking our breath and getting ready for this year. So I'll turn it back to you.
I put myself on mute. Okay, Bob, we don't have Representative McKamey with us yet, so I'm going to just take this opportunity to ask a few follow-up questions, if you don't mind. And you did mention that you have 50% of your polling places open for the general election. What kind of focus did you put on making sure those were safe, or also how to make sure that everybody knew where their polling place was?
So we were fortunate enough in there, and that was another thing that we saw this year. There were a lot of grant opportunities. There was a lot of people looking to assist us. The federal government had grant money. There was private grant money out there. So that allowed us to do a very large education campaign because it was going to be different. So we were consolidating polling places because there were a lot of people that really, really want that in-person voting experience. So what we did is we allowed the in-person voting experience to happen but two ways. You could bring your vote by mail ballot and drop it off at the polling place. So if you still want to go to your polling place, you could do that. Or you would have to vote a provisional ballot. And this is something that, again, we can talk about is you set up and you build your elections based on the equipment and the tools that you have. We didn't have electronic poll books, so we weren't able to allow people that had already received a vote by mail ballot cast their vote on a voting machine. So we had to have them all vote a provisional ballot. So we did a lot of education, a lot of signage, a lot of just really getting out to the public, TV commercials, print, social media, just so people were aware of what was going on and what was about to happen. And we were very fortunate. And again, it goes back to our our local election officials really being challenged to find locations that places that you normally would use were closed. A lot of community centers were not open. You couldn't use them. So one of the things the governor did was if you couldn't find locations and you needed to go to a larger, almost like a vote center kind of scenario, even though schools were open, they were closed for in-person learning on election day. So that would allow us to get into the building and utilize schools and keep everybody safe. So that was something that was new, but it worked out very well.
There's so much in there. I just want to ask you every detail in there, but I will just restrain myself a little bit. And I will ask though about provisional ballots. It was my impression that when there's a great number of provisional ballots, it slows things down and it takes a lot of time because each one has to be handled individually. So if you were suggesting that people who come to the in-person polling place vote on a provisional ballot, were there some consequences that you either understood were coming or that were unexpected?
So one of the things that changed was we allowed voters to bring their vote by mail ballot to the polling place. Normally that's not allowed to drop it off. So we really promoted that to say, you're going to arrive at your polling place and you're going to ultimately vote a paper provisional ballot. Why not just bring your vote by mail ballot with you if you really want to go and have that experience? So that worked out a lot. That helped a lot with that. But you're right, provisional ballots take a while to process. And that was a concern that we had. And that was part of why we allowed them to start counting the vote by mail ballots early, so they could be ahead of that. Because the other thing is you had to count all your vote by mail ballots first before you count your provisional ballots, because you got to make sure that individual didn't vote their vote by mail ballot and then come and vote a provisional ballot. So you had to take care of phase one first before you could even get into phase two. So it was a lot of long hours for our locals.
Got it. And so that kind of takes me to my next question, which is how does the voter know that their ballot was received and counted? And you kind of just explained it here that I mean, that's part. How do I know if my ballot got counted? And the flip is, how do I know somebody else didn't get two ballots in the hopper? Now, you kind of explained that second piece, but if you could just do that a little more slowly, that'd be great.
Okay, great. So we had a tool called Track My Ballot, where a voter could go online and see if their vote by mail ballot was mailed out to them, and to see if it had been received back by the Board of Elections. So that was a tool. It was the first time we used it. We had it for a while, but it wasn't used that widely. So it got a lot of use, and we learned a lot from it. One of the challenges when you have something like that is you want to protect the person's identity, but they need something to log on with, and so trying to not make it so public that anybody could go in and log into your account was a bit of a challenge, but we ended up getting there. And as far as with provisional voting, and just to kind of go over that again, is so if once you're mailed a vote by mail ballot in our state, because we don't have electronic poll books and we can't verify it at the polling place, we don't know if you've returned that ballot. So you vote provisionally on election day in this particular situation in 2020. And then you have to count all of your vote by mail ballots first to make sure you've got that pile of ballots counted, everybody that cast a ballot by mail. And then you count your provisional ballots to make sure that you have that check to see if there's somebody attempting to vote twice, or did somebody make a mistake, or did somebody attempt to vote on behalf of someone else, or try to attempt fraud.
Great, Bob. I totally want to talk more, but I also want to hear from Brian. So we're going to put you on hold for just a moment, and I will come back with what's happening for 2021. Ryan, so if you could use that same question of what were you looking at the start of 2020, and then what was your story for the whole year, and where did we end up at the end of the year?
Sure. Well, I think that the first clue that something was going to not work out the way we expected last year was when the Iowa caucuses did not go as expected. I was there for that. We had rented rooms out in hotels and were really geared up for that. And then that whole system went haywire. They didn't have a conclusive result. That may have helped a little bit in March. I'm a big elections administration nerd. I follow all this stuff. I lived in Oregon when it went to entirely vote by mail. And I've lived in other states and covered local elections as a city reporter for many years. So I spent a lot of hours hanging out with local elections administrators and found that it always paid off to know exactly like how a runoff works, what the threshold is, who calls it. Because at midnight when your boss is yelling at you is not the time to be trying to understand the statute for a rate, covering a race. In March, when everything happened, I went to my editors right away and said, we should do a story about vote by mail. And they said, that's really boring. No one cares. And by the end of March, it was actually like a feature in Business Week. So there was a really quick turnaround there from this is Ryan's pet thing that he cares about to, oh my God, we need to write about this. And by the summer, that became like a full-time story for me among all the other things that I was doing. That was suddenly like my beat was like, how are elections being run? By the late summer, it was not even it was still nominally my beat, but there were now like 4 other people working on it because it was so important. A lot of that came down to people assuming that this would be decisive in the election and who won. And I personally, though I'm not above using that to convince my editor to let me write a story, I personally think that is really vastly overestimated. I think if you look at Wisconsin and what happened in the primary there, that was a really good example of the idea that trying to make changes or not make changes to how an election is run because of how you think that will affect the electorate can backfire, can not work at all the way you expected. And I don't think that at the end of the day, that the way that the election was run or whether votes were cast in person or by mail really made that much of a difference in who won. If it does make a difference, and there's lots of studies about this, it is very minor. It does not increase turnout as much as people hope to vote by mail. It does not seem to increase anything on who votes. The only differences that you can run into is how votes are counted. With vote by mail, there is a higher rejection rate. And that's in part because if you get rejected in person, you can like resolve the issue right then. If you mail in a ballot and it gets rejected, then it kind of depends on how good the system is for following up with you. In some states, they have a vote tracker, which I really think is a great program where it tells you if your ballot has been received and what status it's in. In some states, in California, they'll even text you like when your ballot has been processed, your vote has been counted, like they will actively reach out to you instead of just making it available. But if you mail it in and it gets rejected and then they don't get back in touch with you, that can be a problem. There's also some evidence that vote signatures and that signature matching could be problematic. In Florida, which is one of the few states where we have this kind of data, mail-in ballots are rejected at a vastly higher rate for younger voters and Black and Hispanic voters. And the theory for younger voters is that their signatures are likely to change. Maybe Robert no longer puts a little heart over the I in Giles or changes his signature a little bit over the years so that they may not match what it was when they registered. But there's also evidence, if you look at the county by county level and in Florida, that those rates for Black and Hispanic rejection mail-in votes are not the same. So if there was some outside reason why that's happening, then some structural reason why that's happening, then you would think it would be the same everywhere. But it's also possible that there's some latent racism that causes certain signatures to get rejected at a higher rate. So there's a lot of questions that we don't know. But again, those effects are so marginal that it really doesn't have as much of an effect as I think a lot of the state lawmakers, party leaders, even elections administrators in states that haven't done these things before think. And so a lot of what I wrote last year was really just trying to poke holes in things that people were saying, about what was going on.
Brian, that was fabulous. And I want to, I think the phrase is lift up a couple of things you said. And one is that making changes to election administration based on politics is hard and it can backfire. So I hope I captured.
I can give an exact example of that. In
please.
Colorado, when they went to entirely vote by mail, it was in part because state Democrats thought that it would help them. In fact, when it was implemented, it turned out that Republican voters were more likely to use it. And Senator Cory Gardner former senator now, probably owes the election that he won to that fact in that particular election. By the time he ran for re-election, those either Democratic voters had caught up or the demographics had changed enough that the minor advantage that he gained from that wasn't there. But that is like the classic example that it doesn't work the way you think it will. It's really unpredictable.
So what I'm noticing is that we have the election administrators who just want to do their job and they give me the rules and I'm going to run it. And then you have politicians who are also policymakers and they are thinking both about what's good policy. They're also hearing the message from their party. And these used to be two streams of people. And now I think what you're saying is that the two streams are overlapping a little bit. Is that going too far?
No, I think what happened last year was that prior to last year, a lot of these things were not partisan. The vote by mail differed state by state. Who was better at getting out vote by mail differed state by state. I think like in Arizona and Florida, Republicans had used it for years to their advantage, and Democrats in that state had not been able to use it to their advantage. In other states like Colorado, Democrats had sort of mastered the system of getting their voters to turn them in. And there's kind of a Pepsi versus Coke thing here that if one of them does something, the other is going to match it. So that's one reason why I think it doesn't have as much of an effect as people think, is that the parties respond. There's some evidence that in states that have voter ID, for example, voters of color are at 3 times as likely to be contacted by a campaign, which indicates that in those states when voter ID is implemented, that Democratic campaigns that need voters of color are more likely to say, okay, we got to put more hustle to make sure that we contact them. So those things can counteract it. If you're thinking of these things in a vacuum, as sometimes lawmakers do, we just do this, then this will happen. But it doesn't take into account the second order effects that happen after that.
That was great. And let me ask you also about the signature matching that you mentioned. And I guess I want to come back to a question that's in our chat box and then back to you, Bob, before we go into our second round of official questions. And that has to do with signature matching. So we know that there is a higher rate of rejection for these ballots, but there's some things we can do about that, about signature verification. And Judge Choate has asked this question, Bob, in the chat, how do you do that? So is there anything further you want to add, Ryan, on what signature matching can look like?
Sure.
And then we'll turn it over to Bob for the administrative point of view on that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest pressure point on vote by mail is how to verify that it came from the person. The level of fraud there is higher than in other types of voting, but by such minuscule amounts that it's not really worth worrying about. Like there's no race in which that fraud like swung the race, except for like one example in North Carolina, and that amount of fraud that they were doing was so obvious that it was immediately caught. It's really, really hard to do. And some of the things that you heard last year about, foreign countries were going to somehow interfere. I mean, I was like, there's just like about 1,000 steps there that would make it impossible for them to do that. But the signature matching is really tricky. Areas that have a lot of vote by mail and that have done it for a long time have machines that do this automatically. I think that reduces the potential for sort of a human error there or influence, like as we were talking about, like the people who are deciding whether or not these match being unduly influenced by race or education level or class or something like that. So those are helpful. Signatures are also just, honestly, most of the time I'm signing right now, it's like with a stylus at like a, CVS or something like that. And it looks nothing like my normal signature, which I never use for paper checks. So I'm not sure that there is super accurate way for us to determine someone's identity. The other method that people use is you have some kind of number that you need to write on the ballot envelope, which can then be separated from the ballot, and that can be confirmed. And then usually that's done underneath something so that you're not writing that number on the outside of an envelope that's getting mailed. And that is another form of verification that could just be writing down your driver's license number or something like that. Really simple. So that's another possibility. But I really think that the strongest measure, whatever you do, is just that to have really good systems for ensuring that if you have a ballot that's rejected, or you have a provisional ballot or whatever, that you are making the effort to get back in touch with those voters and ask them, hey, was this you? Or, your ballot was rejected. Do you want to fix it? The states where they don't have those, and the localities where they don't have good systems, and have a much higher rejection rate. And that's where you can run into problems.
Wow, that was great. Bob, jump in there and see what you can tell us about the practicalities of doing the signature verification. And if you could answer the question about do the people whose ballot was rejected know it was rejected, we'll take that off of the list for later.
Okay. So in New Jersey, this was the first year we did signature cures. Because we were going all vote by mail, there was a concern, exactly as Ryan said, that we'd have a large number of rejected ballots. So, it was a program we put in, and if your signature did not match, we reached out to you, sent you a form to basically fill out and send it back, and give you an opportunity to update your signature and verify that, yes, I did cast this vote. And to Ryan's earlier point about the stylus, we found in New Jersey, most of our voter registrations come through motor vehicle, and we have automatic voter registration now. So at motor vehicle, the whole transaction occurs on the signature pads that we're used to seeing, at the stores. So ultimately, your signature is on there, and then when you go from this electronic, signature pad signature to a wet signature using a pen, a lot of times it is different, and anybody who goes to the store knows that. So you try to let people know at motor vehicle that this is your signature. It's going to be on your driver's license. It's going to be in your voter record, but you get these mismatches. So we implemented it pretty quickly, like many things last year. We had to learn. We reached out to other states that are doing it. We reach out to other groups that helped us, and having organizations like the National Association of State Election Directors and National Association of Secretaries of State. You could pick up the phone and you could say, hey, you guys implemented this peer precedent. Judd raised the question, talking to Judd and talking to other states, what is the best way to do it? And working with groups like the election group that helped us. So I think it's important, especially if you're going to do a lot of vote by mail balloting, that you have it, and we found it to be very, very successful this year.
And I'll just say that my daughter got her ballot rejected because she had changed her signature. This was in Colorado where we vote. And it felt so good to me as somebody associated with the election world to know that her change got caught and she was notified and she was given the opportunity to fix it. Okay, now my next question for the two of you before we go to the many questions that are in the chat from the audience is, we've looked at the start and the end of 2020. Where are we? What do you think is going to happen in 2021? And Bob, I'm going to go to you first on this again.
Okay. I think what we kind of, a little bit of time, in New Jersey, our governor's up and our entire legislature. So we don't get a break. A lot of states don't have statewide races or most states don't have statewide races in the odd numbered years. So we jumped right back into it. But we wanted to look at the lessons learned and what could we utilize going into next year. What were the successes? What were the failures? Some of the successes as far as we started using drop boxes for vote by mail last year. Incredibly successful. People really liked that opportunity. there was concerns with the post office being able to deliver the ballots on time. So, and maybe you couldn't get all the way down to your Board of Elections office. So drop boxes, we're going to continue to utilize those going into this year. Where the signature cure is still happening. One of the things that hopefully we don't have to use this year that we used last year, and I know a lot of states did, is the National Guard. That was something unique, and they've been deployed not occasionally in the past, but to utilize them in so many different ways. They were out of uniform and they were incredible. They just jumped right in and helped, whether you needed them at a polling place, you needed them to work in your election office, and they were ready to go. And it was kind of a unique opportunity for them because they're out there defending democracy. They got to kind of pull the curtain back and see how elections run, and a lot of them really walked away with this really good feeling. So as far as that, like I said, we hope we don't have to use them, but it's nice to know that they are out there. And I think just some of the things we learned that we have to do better on is like with legislators, giving the locals and the election officials a longer runway. You saw because last year we had to do things, and we had to do things in a very condensed timeline. But you saw where you ran into problems when you did that, and you had difficulties doing that. So I think that's a good lesson learned to say, we did all vote by mail in 3 months. It's a huge undertaking. But it's not something you would ever want to do, but you don't want to fall and say, well, if you did that in 3 months, you can do anything, and they can do anything when the situation calls for it. But I think it's really important that that's one of the lessons learned. And then the equipment that you have, you don't realize how much you rely on the equipment you have, and if it's outdated and then an emergency comes up, you're a bit strapped at times, because now the entire country was looking to buy, envelope openers and printers and scanners, and it was this mad scramble to see who could buy what first, and it pitted states against each other to get equipment. The same with the PPE. You had everybody out there looking for PPE. So there are things you can prepare for. Like making sure equipment's up to date, and making sure you have adequate equipment and supplies. Things you really can't plan for is like a pandemic, but we've learned so much from this that will be applied across the board.
Thank you, Bob. I'm thinking that there is a great parallel between trying to get the election equipment and hospitals trying to get masks last year. And you also made the point that it takes time to make change, and it also takes time for policymakers to think about what needs to happen. So they digested they're in the process of digesting last year and then coming up with what they want to be looking forward to. Ryan, what do you think you're seeing this year? You've had your eye, I think, pretty closely on what's going on in legislatures, at least.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing. When I was asked by my editors, who were convinced that election day was going to blow up because there were so many problems, and I said, look, local elections directors are like Santa Claus. They work all year to make sure that one day goes off well. And last year was maybe like one of those, claymation cartoon specials that you watch where it's like, everyone's scrambling to make sure that Santa can get the presents out on time, and it comes through in the end. Last year was a miracle, where it really showed the resilience of the local systems that we have. I think there were a lot of problems that people saw. There were also a lot of workarounds that they came up with. What I see going forward is that a lot of things about voting, voters like to do things the way they've done them in the past. I think it's going to be harder than lawmakers think to roll back some of the things that were put in temporarily, because voters tried them and voters liked them by and large. I think that in areas where, because vote by mail has become politicized now, I still think you're going to see more early voting, because there was a lot of early voting and that was successful and people liked it, and it's not as politicized. So I definitely expect an increase in that. I think that blue states outside of the West will move towards all vote by mail elections. We're seeing that in the Northeast now. Previously, that had been limited to like Washington, Oregon, and Republican states like Utah. But I think that largely rural states are going to adopt that, move toward that model more, and allowing that regardless of the politics. I think that in the very tight states like Arizona, Georgia, I think that you're going to see a lot of fighting over the rules and a lot of attempts to, sort of change the rules in ways that the lawmakers think might benefit their side. I do see some of the polarization that came about last year not going away. Generally in American politics right now, once something is polarized, it stays polarized. There's a lot of things that aren't polarized, but once that partisanship kicks in, it's really hard to undo. So I do think that you're going to see going forward probably more Democrats supporting vote by mail, more Democratic lawmakers supporting vote by mail. It may take a couple of election cycles for Republicans in those states to say, we should be doing more outreach this way, or let's catch up, or, getting rid of things that vote by mail and getting pushback from voters who, why can't we do this? Like in Arizona, they've always had a permanent vote by mail list, and there's legislation to get rid of that. I don't think that's going to go anywhere because people like that permanent absentee list. But it will really only be an issue in those really, really tightly contested states.
And you talked about the increase of absentee or mail voting in Democratic states in the East, and New Jersey is, of course, the example of that. But I do want to pick up on something you said about Utah being a state with all mail elections and Republican leadership in the legislature and the governor as well. And Montana is very close to that as well. And I'm so sorry that Representative McKamey was not able to join us. I believe she's literally on the floor at this moment. So we're all a little disappointed she isn't here. But there's another very much Republican state that uses mail ballots for most everything. And I think a point she was going to make is that they've left it up to the counties to decide. So this isn't top down, it's a county decision. So that's a little bit of a shift in there.
And every single county in Montana chose to do it.
In 2020, yeah.
Yeah, so I count them as an all vote by mail state because like they are, but technically they aren't because they left it to the locals.
Got it. And then I guess the other thing is that even if you are a mostly mail state, you're still running some in-person operations. And even if you're a mostly in-person voting state, you're running some amount of absentee voting. So all states have to figure out what the balance.
Yeah, it's a misnomer when it is a misnomer when I say all vote by mail states, because they do have early voting centers because voters with language barriers or who with disabilities need to be able to vote in person. So you can't ever get rid of all of that, but you can have these early voting centers and have them open longer hours.
So now I'm going to turn to questions from the audience, and we have quite a few here. And Bob, I hate to say it, but most of them have your name on it, so be prepared here. The first thing that came through was, what can we do to ensure that the United States Postal Service is better prepared for absentee voting? And I'm thinking this is an opportunity for you to say that the National Association of State Election Directors is in good communication on that.
Well, now I don't. Yeah, now I don't need to answer. That was a great answer. No, and it's true. Like the national organizations are reaching out in each state, and I think it's important to be in touch with your local postmasters. And so New Jersey's divided into two sections. There's a north and a south, and they meet regularly, and they have been meeting regularly to discuss the issues that come up, and there was a lot of concerns last year, and was my ballot going to get there? When they put something out that says prepare for a 15-day round trip, the ballot out and the ballot back, that's concerning to people. So and the post office is one of those agencies that they have to be on time and correct 100% of the time, or they're going to get criticized. And no matter how many millions and millions of pieces they pass through, it's that one that they miss that always is a ballot or is something. And I know they worked hard. They especially in New Jersey, like I said, we met with them on a regular basis, and I think that's the key to stay on top of it. Let them know when you're sending your mailers out. Let them know when you're expecting the mail back so they can ramp up to have their facilities ready. I think that was the biggest thing. Make sure they're doing a sweep, that you have people that are sweeping all the facilities, whenever your deadline is. That deadline day, they have to have extra hands on, and they have to have people there ready to make sure it's not sitting on a box, in a box in the corner, and then you find it the next day and they're all too late. So I think that local communication is so critical. Nationally, they're dealing with a lot. It really does come down to the locals.
I'm so glad you said that, because I was thinking about associations such as yours sending in letters or something to the USPS, but really it's if you connect to your local postmaster and have that good communication.
Yep.
Ryan, for you, the question is, we've got a lot of people who are local election officials on the line. How do they operate in regard to reporters? I mean, rather than being scared of reporters, there's a way to make it successful for both parties. Any advice you've got for them?
Yeah, I would, reach out a couple weeks before an election to like the Metro editor, or if you specifically know which reporter is, going to be covering the local elections, and suggest that you invite them in and show them around and talk about processes and procedures. I teach a class on journalism, and I tell my students, like, you need to get your local elections director's like cell phone number and find out where their wife works or husband works, like, so that you need to be able to get a hold of that person like at 2 a.m. if you have to, because I think that can really help if you can talk through. And they should be doing this. I think a lot of local news is really strained right now because they just don't have the manpower that they used to. So they should be doing this. But if you're an elections director, reach out and say, hey, I'd love to bring you in, show you the system, talk you through some of the laws or, local rules that might come into play to help answer those questions, because it's a lot easier to do that ahead of time. It also might not hurt to suggest, doing a Q&A or myths, fact check kind of thing about your local voting, because voting differs so much from area to area and state to state. There are a lot of things that people heard that, that aren't true in their state, aren't true in their locality, but they heard it because they were watching national news, and that's where most people are getting their news now. So to be able to say, no, actually in our area, we don't do that.
And this is the first time I remember there being concern in one state about how people are voting elsewhere. And maybe that's because people weren't paying attention to election administration till this time. But now we care not only how do we vote, how do the people in the rest of our state vote, but now we care about how people vote in other parts of the nation. Yeah, absolutely. That is going to, and there's, I found it remarkable about the intricacy with which things were getting polarized. Somebody mentions drop boxes here in the question. The drop boxes, like from my standpoint as just a reporter whose job is to just look at sort of what the facts say, those are absolutely safe. The people who make the drop boxes for putting in ballots also make similar boxes for like opiates and cash and library books, and maybe not library books, but I think that like heroin and money are things that people really want to get their hands on, and if they can't, then that design is probably safe for a ballot. There was an attempt in one area by someone to set some ballots on fire inside a drop box. It didn't work. There's not enough air inside. They were able to recover most of the envelopes, figure out who the ballots had come from, and contact those people and have them fill out another ballot. And the other nice thing about vote by mail is that anytime you're messing with the post office, that's that's bad news for you. So you really don't want to mess with the mail because that's federal crimes. Ryan, this is the very first time heroin has come up on a webinar that I've been associated with, so new territory for us. Bob, we've got two questions in the chat about online voting. What will computers do for us in the future? Just tell us, is that in our future or not? One of the questions was even in regard to if the Postal Service is a little weak, would we shift over? What do you think?
I don't see true online voting happening anytime in the near future. There's just so many concerns, and the problem that we face with that, there are legitimate reasons to do that, especially with our military and overseas voters. For years it was, okay, we'll let them fax. Well, the reality is there's no fax machines anywhere, out in the field. So you start to find yourself in this dilemma. How, here are these men and women out there defending democracy, and we can't get them a ballot, or they can't get it back. Regular mail just is not accessible. So you have to introduce, electronic delivery and electronic return. Now, it may not be true online voting, but whether it's by email and those are the things we've been talking about. When we were putting together the latest set of voluntary voting system guidelines, the Technical Guidelines Development Committee, that becomes part of it. And FBAP has, the Overseas Voting Initiative that they do with the Council of State Governments, and that's a big thing we talk about, to say, if the post office, and we did run into that, where there were parts of the world where the post office were closed to American mail, or we wouldn't take it. So there was this dilemma we had of how do we deal with that? And there are no fax machines. When people keep saying, well, just fax it, they're not for that. And that's just something we've seen, or very few. So it's a discussion that's going on, and not only for the military and overseas, but voters with disabilities. So there's two segments of our voting population that legitimately need that, but it's how do we get there? I don't see it, mainstream, but I see us going in that direction, where voters with disabilities, and in some states they are allowing it. We did allow electronic return for one of our spring elections. We do electronic ballot delivery, and we do allow the military and overseas voters to return them electronically by email, but just straight online voting for the mainstream is probably quite a ways off. But I think we will see a lot of discussion for the military and overseas, and for voters with disabilities.
I'm going to go ahead and say that online voting for people other than those in extreme circumstances like that is never going to happen. And the reason that I say that is that if you know a computer programmer, ask them if they have an Alexa. They don't. And the reason why is because they don't trust code, because code always can be broken. And there is just no way that you are ever going to be able to do a secure election online. You cannot do it. It's not possible. Software is vulnerable and will always be vulnerable. That is just a fact of life. So I don't see that happening really on a widespread basis. And the Bitcoin guys can talk about using the methods that they use for cryptocurrencies. I just don't see it happening.
Excellent. So we are coming close to the top of the hour, and I do want to ask, because I work for the National Conference of State Legislatures, if you could each take a moment to comment on what is the responsibility of the legislature versus what's the responsibility of the election officials. And I know that could be very broad, but we got a couple of questions here about the Minnesota Secretary of State taking an action without legislative approval, and others about what legislation is coming. So what's the difference? And Brian, I'll go to you first, and Bob, just to mix it up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the state legislature and Congress is the biggest thing that they can do is set minimum standards so that areas don't try to game the system, and provide money, because equipment and manpower is really the biggest problem that local administrators run into.
Great, boy, that was quick. Bob, you work with your legislature. What do you see as the role between them and you?
So, and we learned a lot this year, because the governor, because of the pandemic, had to issue a lot of executive orders. So there was a lot of lessons learned, and probably the biggest lesson learned from that and from passing legislation is partnerships. That is the key to that the legislature needs to work with their local, state and local election officials. They need to engage their secretaries of state. I know our Secretary Way is very involved, but getting the local election officials at the table, not just, but listening to them. And I think that is really the key. Legislators see things happening in other states, and maybe it works there because it, like vote by mail, took years to develop, and it's not something you can just do overnight, or you can do, in a few months. And I said it earlier that the local election officials need that runway, an adequate runway to get things up and running. It's not as if they are not saying they cannot do it. And a lot of times that it comes across, unfortunately, that way to legislators that, oh, they're just naysayers, but that's not, they want to make sure it gets done right and it's transparent and accurate. So I think that's the one takeaway, that you got to keep pushing those partnerships. So you got to make sure, you have a seat at the table.
And I was going to give you both a moment to give a final wrap up. If there's something that's absolutely burning, certainly we could do it. Ryan, a burning comment you want to make before I close?
Only thing that we haven't touched on is election audits. These are done in some areas after the election has been certified. They do like a random sampling, and they invite the public in. The whole thing is live streamed. They have reporters come. It's kind of festive. They do these in Rhode Island. And they basically pull a random sample of ballots and check them like very openly in front of everyone to show that they match what was in the system. And their numbers are chosen, they roll 8-sided die, like the Dungeons and Dragons ones. And they pick the numbers. So I think that is one way to help restore trust. I think that is going to be a huge problem going forward, is restoring voter trust.
I'm so glad you mentioned audits. They're a little complicated to understand, but that might be the next thing going on in legislatures to try to bring those to more states. Bob, any last comment from you?
Just really quickly, I think we need to continue the conversation. I think events like this are really important to share information across the states. And again, having these national associations like the National Association of State Election Directors is so critical. But so we don't want to be 10 years from now and this is completely forgotten and something else happens and we don't have this documented properly. We're not ready for, it may not be a pandemic next time. In 2012, we had Hurricane Sandy, somewhat prepared us for this. So you don't want, that I look back at, 8-9 years ago now, we're talking about. So you don't want these lessons learned to be lost.
Fabulous, good point there. And when you talked about the partnerships, I just want to say the University of Minnesota and the National Conference of State Legislatures are thinking about not just the partnership between our two organizations, but how can we partner to help election officials be connected to legislators. Then that's the two halves that you were talking about. So that's something I hope will have some traction as we go into this decade. And then my takeaways from this conversation are that when I look at 2020, the local and state election officials really deserve a great deal of credit for what they did between March 10th or 12th and November 6th. And it didn't even end November 6th, all the counting and such afterwards. An amazing job of late nights and weekend work. And my hat is off to you folks. And then also the voters deserve equal credit because we know we had higher turnout this year, by far the highest turnout in 100 years. So voters figured out that it mattered and they figured out how to do what they needed to do. And then I want to also give credit to the press for changing the story about elections from just the horse race to let's understand how our elections work. So I'm feeling pretty good having had this conversation with the two of you. I really appreciate you being here. And for all of you who are on the outside, I appreciate you coming to here, and you're welcome to reach out to any of us afterwards. And with that, I will just say, stay safe and stay in touch. Thank you.